Hi, everybody. Welcome to a Composer Coffee Break. And I'm going to fade out our intro music, which you haven't recognized that. That's Happy Birthday. There's quite an interesting story to that, which I may tell someday. That's actually my father playing. Let me switch over to me. And there I am. I am your host, Elliot Miles McKinley. You can see down there, there's my name. I hope everybody's doing okay tonight. This is a special episode, if you will, of a composer's coffee break. And I'm like super happy, first of all, to have a couple friends of mine in with me tonight to chat about some aspects of theory and theory pedagogy and some ideas and share thoughts and to take your questions. So if you are watching us at home, and I'm going to monitor the chat over here, please say hello. First of all, introduce yourselves. And at any time, if you have comments or questions, I will, like I said, I will look at the comments and questions coming in, and we'll happily pass them on to our guests if you have them for any specific person. I am going to also ask, as I should do, for you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, if you would like to get further updates and videos. We'll have more videos like this, my coffee break series, my listening room series, and of course there's the Composers at Home Maybe Drinking Coffee, which has its own channel. And here's the shameless plug via the mug. And I will tell you guys at the end of the show about the next episodes. So also let us know if our audio is good as well, or if our audio is not good, because sometimes it's hard for me to tell whether or not the audio stream is good going out to the house, as it were. Anyway, so tonight we're going to explore, myself and my two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Pete Smucker from Stetson University and Dr. Erich Stem from Indiana University Southeast. We're going to talk about music theory. We all teach music theory, and Pete is a theorist and Erich is a composer. But again, composers are often pressed into teaching music theory. I teach music theory as well. And so we're going to talk about our experience, but also start talking about ways ways of modulating the pedagogy, and maybe the ways that we're seeing how music theory is being absorbed by our students, and maybe make some impactful changes perhaps in the future. So we'll kind of see where the discussion goes. But I am now going to introduce our guests. We'll switch scenes here, and we'll take you into, boom, there they are. There's Pete and Erich. So how are you guys doing tonight?
Doing great.
Good, yeah.
Great.
Really glad to be here.
I'm gonna pop myself into the scene.
And Elliot, I just want to say, great coffee mug. Okay. The check needs to be in the mail though, so just,
there you go.
I'm the official model of the composers
right.
maybe drinking coffee.
So which one of these things is not like the other? Pete does not have a Composers at Home Maybe Drinking Coffee.
And I am also the theorist, so I see
also, yeah, that's right. Notice that the composers have the mug, right? Exactly,
that's right. But I do drink coffee.
That's true. And maybe we'll actually start with that. That seems like a good place to start.
Why don't you have a mug for theorists? Yes, let's
that's right.
dig into that question.
Yeah. Theorists at home, maybe drinking coffee. No, actually, this is I think we'll start with a little bit about how we all know each other, and then I'll let you guys talk a little bit about your own backgrounds and experiences. Of course, I've known both of you for many years, and Pete, so actually related to coffee, both Pete and I did graduate work at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And in fact, that's where we met. We met one August afternoon, I guess. Might have
Yeah,
been.
near the start of the school year,
Right.
and it was, I think it was after some big meeting for all graduate students, and I came over and you had asked a question or something, and I think I had came over
Yeah.
to your vicinity and was like, hey, who asked that question? Or it was something like that.
Something like that. It
Yeah.
was like pretty much a graduate student orientation, but for like the whole university. It wasn't just for the
Yeah.
School of Music, because they School of Music had their own
Right.
session, and that was later. And so we went to that, and it was basically all the usual stuff about, like, go here, do this, do that, these resources, blah blah blah. And I did ask a question. I can't remember what I did, but it prompted you to come over and say, "Oh, hey, I'm also going to the School of Music," and so forth. And that actually led me. It led to you asking me for a ride home.
Is that
Remember
how it
that?
worked? I
Right.
can't
I
remember.
I gave, because I had a car, you didn't, and
Oh, that's right. And we
and
were in Minneapolis and I was over in St. Paul.
right. And I
Um,
said, sure. I figured, I'll meet somebody. So I actually gave Pete a ride home
that's
that
right.
first day. And Pete invited me in, and I met Angie, his wife, who's a fabulous singer. And the first thing I noticed, and we had a conversation about this, was I went into your kitchen,
I
and there were
noticed where
like
this was going.
17 coffee makers in there. And I said,
Yeah.
"You like coffee much?" and,
Yeah,
and you and I
that's
both
right.
started nerding out a little bit about coffee.
That's right.
And
So we many coffees we've had together
yes, yes,
from that day. I think we had coffee then.
we did, because I think
If I
you
believe.
said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?"
Yeah,
I
that's right.
said, I think that
And
led to that.
and and I do have to add too, appropriate to what we'll be talking about today is, part of that conversation we were just getting to know one another, and it's been a great friendship with Elliot ever since then. Um, but one of the things we talked about was a textbook,
Right.
and
That's right.
it was Schoenberg's theory of harmony.
This is
For
correct.
whatever reason, I don't even know how we got to that topic, but we ended up the first day we met talking about Schoenberg's harmony
Yes.
text,
Yes, we did.
and so there you go. It's come full
It
circle
has
now.
come full circle where uh X number of years, I'm not going to do the math, but X number of years later, we are talking theory here, on a complete on in a manner that you and I could probably not have guessed back then,
That's right.
that we would be doing this in this fashion, in this particular way. But just an interesting side note. I don't know if you remember, but we also shared the same TA office, right? That first year. And of course, I bought that fancy coffee maker. Remember that? Put it up by near Carl's desk
I
on
think I
the
remember
windowsill,
this.
with a
That's
grind.
right.
I think it maybe grinded its own
Yeah,
coffee or something. I can't remember. So we had good coffee in the theory
we
TA
did. We
office.
did.
We
We needed it.
yes, yes, we did. I was kind of an interloper though, because I was sort of not supposed to be there, but I just moved myself in there anyways. I don't
Oh,
know
I
if you
don't remember
remember that.
that. I just always assumed you were supposed to be
Yeah, because
there. I think.
I just, I figured you guys had a nicer office than we did, so I just kind of went in there anyway. That's another story. So anyway, that's how we met. Let's. I'm gonna switch over to, on this side. I have to do my left and my right, to Eric. Um, so Eric and I met the first year I was teaching at Indiana University East. So my very first gig out of grad school was teaching, assistant professor at IU East, teaching music, pretty much teaching everything, because I had to teach everything. And I was looking at the other campuses, and I noticed that there's a composer in residence, and like not like an actual composer there. Oh, Eric, so I looked you up, and I think I emailed you, and then we talked on the phone, and I went down for a visit, and that started our friendship, 12 years ago, I guess now.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And that was at the time I was running the record label New Dynamic Records, and so I think I was on gosh, year number 7, I think it
Mm-hmm.
was. And so we were talking about going down to San Antonio, Texas to record with the Solo
Right.
Chamber Ensemble. So
Right.
yeah,
Right. And we've been plotting ever since. Various
plotting other
plotting other, yeah, right.
adventures.
Always ventures, right there. There's always a project, always something to
I
be
always get
done.
the email every year. We need a scheme on something. So this
Right.
is yeah,
Right.
an
Right.
ongoing thing,
Right. And
definitely.
it is always happening. And again, I think you and I back then couldn't imagine that we would be having, say, a conversation like this in this
Right.
particular modality. So
Mm.
anyway, so those at home, if you would again, just remind you that I am monitoring the chat. So if you have any comments or questions for us while we kick off our discussion, please do at any time. There's about a 7 or 8 second, sometimes 9 second delay between when you type something and we see it. So if we don't immediately respond, don't worry, I'll get to it. So I want to open our discussion with a broad question, I guess, and I'll let maybe I'll let Erich start the answer. And the broad question is this: is what is your, and it's a huge question, so answer it how you want. As a composer, I guess maybe I'll frame it this way: what is your approach to teaching music theory, and how have you seen that approach change, if at all, over the time that you've started your full-time teaching career?
Yeah. So at IUS, and I imagine this is probably true of a lot of undergraduate, curriculum uh, or curriculums, that we teach a 2-year theory sequence. So basically 3 semesters of tonal music, with the third semester being chromatic, and then we reserve the last semester for um, 20th century mainly, but also
Mm-hmm.
with a little intro to contemporary music. And so and the ear training aspect of that is also reflected in that kind of setup. And I teach the second year, so I teach the third semester, which is then
Mm-hmm.
the chromatic aspect of tonal music, and then I lead them into the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And while they get a heavy dose of part writing in the first year, so the first 2 semesters, and they get very familiar with tonal music,
Mm-hmm.
and most of it is pretty much just going up to the board and doing part writing exercises,
Right.
that sort of thing. I take a more analytical approach to teaching theory because for a couple reasons. One practical one, that several of them are going to go off to graduate school, so it's good to have very good analytical skills, especially if you're trying to get in, and if you're also taking classes in graduate
Mm-hmm.
school, it's good to have those skills there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do a lot of score reading in my third semester chromatic class.
Mm-hmm.
And then the challenge really in teaching theory is that I get 1 semester to do the 20th century, and even
Mm-hmm.
maybe introduce a little bit of what happened
Yeah.
this first 20 years, right, of this
Mm-hmm.
century. And so I have to really kind of pick my, the different types of major movements that went on in the 20th century, but also approach it with a broad theoretical approach, that where they could learn this approach and apply it to a lot of different pieces.
Right.
And so I kind of take a it's what some will characterize as a parametric analysis. So taking different elements of music and talking about that and how that forms into describing the language of the music and the process
Mm-hmm.
of it and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So I do that because I think, number one, I get a lot of different majors, as most of you probably do in the undergraduate. So I get composers, I get people who are aspiring to be performers, I get people who are music education majors,
Mm-hmm.
and so I need to do it in such a way that number one, it sort of beefs up their knowledge about a particular era or style or
Mm-hmm.
language of music, but it
Mm-hmm.
also helps them learn something that they can apply to new works later down the road, especially the composers.
Right.
So I'm not going to really, for example, my composers, I'm not going to worry about whether or not, or obsess too much whether or not they are experts at spelling certain chords that are not or haven't been used in, the past 70 years.
Right.
And they will never use themselves, more than I am
Mm-hmm.
going to obsess about their approach to, hey, if you have a particular work that you like and you like that style,
Mm-hmm.
here's the one way that you can approach,
Mm-hmm.
analyzing it, tearing it apart, so that you
Mm-hmm.
can incorporate some of the ideas in your works, or put your own spin to what's
Mm-hmm.
going on.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
that's a general,
Which,
like,
sure.
primer. Yeah.
Admittedly, it's a huge question,
Yeah.
one
So
that could take a long, depending on, going into in down details, right? But just as an
mhm,
overview of kind of your approach, which
right.
is good, and it brings up some questions, but we'll ask those soon enough. So let's switch over to Pete. So there, so Pete, how would you answer that same question? Of course, now you're not a composer, so Pete's
Right.
is a theorist, and maybe for the folks at home, I think it might be more for some people, the uninitiated might uh, be more well aware of like what a composer is, but you might want to also say like, well, what is a music theorist? Number one, and number two, what actually sent you? This is a curious question, too. Is what sent you down the road to become a music theorist from your own like what sent you down that hole that got you
Sure.
now all the way to being a professional?
Yeah, sure. So these are all, as you said, really big questions, and we have time to get into all of that stuff. So, um, I'll start with this. When I meet somebody for the first time, and oh, what do you do? And I sometimes hesitate to say, well, I'm a music theorist, because inevitably, oh, it's, the reactions are usually like, oh, okay,
Right,
or, well, what is that? What do you do? Which is what you're
right.
asking me now. And in some ways, it's a very complex, long explanation, and in others, it's not. I think maybe one simple way of thinking of it is that I am interested in um, understanding music in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's in those varieties of ways of understanding music that I do my work.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, so that's maybe a short, fast answer. I think of
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah.
Music theorists, music analysts, I think are interested in making sense of music
Mm-hmm.
in various ways, and so those are with coming up with unique theories of how to listen, or how to hear, or
Mm-hmm.
how to understand.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I think music theory is very interdisciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of ways to pull in lots of different disciplines to understand music. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there's crossover with psychology and cognition, or um, uh, computer science,
Mm-hmm.
um, or mathematics, or various aspects of the humanity. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, I just realized my Alexa's
You're-
trying to talk to us here.
Alexa
I'll
wants to.
put that on mute.
Would you ask Alexa why she became a music theorist?
Yeah, it would be interesting if we wanted to. We could ask Alexa what music theory is, but I'd be a
We'll
little
save that to
afraid.
later.
We'll
But
save that for later.
yeah,
But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know if you want me to tweak that out a little bit more, but maybe for people who are like, well, what is a music theorist?
mm,
I think
mm-hmm.
that's a basic answer.
Yeah, yeah,
Typically, as composers, we don't write music necessarily, but
mm-hmm.
we may. But a lot of theorists teach, um, but I think there are interesting avenues that some people are exploring. Well, you might have a degree, say, in music theory, but
Right.
that might lend itself to other uh, job opportunities. I think you don't necessarily have to be a professor at a university.
Sure, sure.
Thinking like, well, you might set yourself well to work at some place like um, Pandora with, algorithms for playlists or things like that. I think, but for the most part, music theorists we teach it at the university level,
Yeah.
typically. And then you were curious how I got here, right?
No,
I can quickly do that. I mean, we can spin back around to that.
actually more, well, I mean, sure, you can say how you got there because it is an interesting thing, but also, um, I think you kind of answered it, but maybe you want to tie this up
Mm-hmm.
in a way of like, so your approach to teaching music theory is, I'm guessing, has to do with the fact that you are also instilling this sort of sense of curiosity, or at least answer or satiating the aspect of curiosity in your students about why music works, right?
Yeah. So, and we can get into a little bit of uh, kind of what Eric was talking about. We do some things very similarly here at Stetson. We kind of have the core music theory courses, and we try to have a very integrated type of curriculum with our oral training. We have a separate oral training sequence and functional keyboard sequence, and we do a lot of, they have their own unique things that they do, but also we try to integrate that for their training, as it so to speak, as for becoming musicians, well-rounded musicians, not just music educators or performers or composers or whatever. But yeah, maybe just to expand a little bit, one of the things I sometimes tell my students is that I am interested in relationships. This note doesn't mean anything necessarily by itself. I mean, now you can talk about its quality and all these things, but as soon as you introduce its relationship to something else, it takes on new meaning. And so context, my students get me tired of saying, well, the context matters.
Right.
In analysis, well, what is it? Is it this? And I think a lot of students like black and white answers, and there is black and white answers in music theory, but there's also a lot of gray answers. Sure. Well, depending on your interpretation of this analysis, how are you explaining this relationship? So I think, and that draws in the interdisciplinary sorts of ideas. I think a lot of what we teach at the undergrad level is, for lack of a better word, the fundamentals. You can't bring in these other
things,
ways, until you can kind of understand the basics of certain things. But yeah, so I think underlying a lot of what I teach is context. Context matters, and the relationships that something in this context, this relationship has a totally different meaning with a different relationship. However you want to play that out, relating that to cinema or relating it to whatever.
Funny that you mentioned, I literally said those very words, that context matters, pretty much all of last week during my music theory 2 class, because I have one student in particular who really wants things to be exactly what they are, and gets quite, I don't want to say he doesn't get upset, but it bothers him that it could be something else. And so, like a German augmented 6th chord, he's like, but that's just a dominant 7th chord. I'm like, yes, but it's not functioning exactly like a dominant 7th chord all the time, and because of this and that, whatever. But you know what?
Yeah, perfect. That's a perfect example. Depending on its context and its relationship with how other things are happening. Yeah.
I also will say, to that point, I will say spelling matters as well, because spelling often conveys intention, right? So, but that's another thing I try to hammer home. And it's funny that Erich said, I don't really care if you spell the chord right, but I know what you mean by that, right? Is like, as a composer, you know, if it's a D sharp or an E flat, sometimes you make a practical decision about whether it's a D sharp or an E flat,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? Um, so anyway, so this is interesting. It brings up now some questions and thoughts and maybe ways we can begin to talk. Is what, and I'll let each of you handle this question. What has been something of a challenge in teaching music theory, or perhaps challenges teaching music theory to undergrads? And have you seen that shift in the years since teaching? Like have those challenges gone from one thing to another? Have they gotten larger? I'm just kind of curious to see what kind of, you know, in your own, you know, when you assess your own teaching and you assess your students' uh, learning, right? What are some of those like stumbling blocks? Are they consistent, or are they changing, or are they, you know? I'm just curious to kind of see where what you guys have noticed. So Pete, I guess we'll start with you.
Yeah, and I mean, happy to bounce back and forth too. It doesn't have to be, just me for a few minutes. But yeah, Eric, chime in. I mean, if you want to. This is a good question. It's a hard one, I think. So there's probably a few places we could go. Maybe one thing is building a little bit from what Eric mentioned. Uh, we have a very similar sort of 3 semester sequence of mostly tonal music and chromatic music, and then our 4th semester is 20th century
It's like
music.
quick 20th century. Yeah. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
Right.
so I think that one of the challenges of teaching this is, we are now just about to start our 3rd decade of the 21st century, and uh, the expanding music, it's impossible to get to, and
Right.
so uh, it's that has been a challenge to try to figure out, well, what should we um, teach, what repertoire, and since it's a different type of system that you've been doing, you've been teaching. I think it's a challenge when you get to that type of class
Mm-hmm.
where for 3 semesters you've been teaching this system of tonality.
Yep.
Yet then all of a sudden in 1 semester, well, you have to basically very quickly learn completely different systems of relationships
Right.
with pitches or microtones or
Right.
whatever
Right.
that composer
Right.
was doing in their
Right.
system.
Right.
And then to try to get them to understand both the system and then appreciate that maybe historically or where it fits in. I think that's an immense challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
I don't know. I mean, yeah.
yeah, I think that's very true. And so it is that shift, from that 3rd semester to that 4th. That is a big challenge, not only just in terms of getting their heads into okay, now we've abandoned this system, and
Mm-hmm.
now we're going to teach a little bit about other approaches of composers who decide not to do this system, but develop, a completely different one.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that has been the challenge, to answer your question, Elliot, is how do you get them prepped to being able to do that, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
going
Right.
from the 19th to the 20th century.
Right.
And one thing that I think I do, and I'm sure you guys do this as well, because I'm hearing it, which is, you just said the magic word, context, right? And you also said the other magic word, which is relationships.
Hmm.
If you can drill in their head that relationships, this is not this particular chord because it is what it is. It's that particular chord because of what happens next to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or what happens
Mm-hmm.
right after.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get them to think about, like, for example, when you think about modulation techniques, when you think of common tone modulation, right? A lot of times composers will use rhythm and time to slow things down so as to absorb that common tone before the next chord and the next key hits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I get them to look at, and this is kind of my prepping in the 3rd semester, I get them to think beyond just harmony and what's in the key signature and all that other good stuff. I get them to think about rhythm. I get them to think about register. You know, when Schubert, for instance, wants to outline a four chord, he may actually hit, you know, each pitch of that four chord at the, you know, first beat, you know, in the high register, right? And that kind of will structurally you know, bring out that four chord even more than just hitting, you know, the regular chord
Mm-hmm.
and the other register. So I get them to think about register too. And then I get to say, okay, beginning of the spring, let's talk about everything we talked about when it comes to context and relationships. Now let's just not have, let's not use keys anymore. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how form can be used or, you know, created with these relationships happening, but now we're going to talk about other elements that are all going to come into play. So, you know, and so I think that kind of is a nice little landing pad for the introduction into the 20th century.
Right.
But I think to answer your question, I'm going to shift that gear a little bit more myself and say that I think the really difficult thing that I don't believe I have yet to answer, because we have, you know, we know what our classes are, and we know we have to teach certain things. You know, if we use a textbook, we have to teach certain things from that, I guess, or we understand what we're covering. But the question of how's this, how is teaching this system and or teaching the techniques of this system going to be relevant to either the music they're listening to or the music that they're going to compose. And I often think, I don't, you know, I do lose some sleep about this sometimes. I wonder if I'm doing them a good service by not tying in what's going on now. You know, I often have to say to some students when they ask really good questions, because music theory sounds like a topic of the present, right? This is the theory of music, right? It's not, it doesn't say anything about historical tendencies of older composers.
Sure.
So I have to constantly remind them, this is a history lesson.
Yeah,
right. This chord,
There's
you'll
a
never see
different
this chord
thing.
again. When we talk about the German 6/5, right? You're not going to see this chord, and you're not going to compose it. And if you do, people are going to give you funny looks.
Or you can do it as a pastiche, but you know,
right.
Yeah,
That's the only way you can get away with it.
Yeah, this is a really good point, I think, and it's I think it's something that we and I can't speak for, you know, our entire field or anything, but it's something we struggle with. It's this relevance,
right?
And trying to meet this generation of students,
right?
And making things relevant for them, I think, and yeah, so I agree. I think that's a really big challenge. I think moving forward, and another thing I would just thought about that sort of related to what you were just saying, Eric, was sort of the chronology of it. I mean, it sounds like you go pretty chronologically. Like theory 3 is your 19th century stuff, a lot of the high chromaticisms, and then you flip over to theory
Debussy.
4. Yeah, Debussy, exactly. Yeah, that sort of thing. And you know, one thing we've done, just as an example, and this I'll plug this word, and we can go there or not. It's up to you, Elliot. But you know, we've actually made it so that you can take theory 3 or 4 in either order. So the prerequisite for theory 4.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the prerequisite is theory 4 is only theory 2, so they have to at least understand modulation and chromaticisms and up to a certain point. And then, you know, because in some ways, all of those, kind of like what you're saying, Eric, a lot of those chords, you don't have to have learned that to talk about the music of the 20th and 21st centuries. You know, and so if you can understand, you know, seventh chords, or chords with an added sixth, you can understand Debussy, right? So I think, and so we've tried that, but this is a larger approach, and I have to give full credit to many of my colleagues out there who are more really in the trenches with music theory pedagogy, but there's work on, you know, modular teaching, so ways to find modules and being able to kind of put them in lots of different orders with how
Mm-hmm.
you
How
create
you
a
do
theory
this.
curriculum.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's an interesting, just a little bit of a modular sort of idea of what we have, is you can kind of take things in different
Uh-huh.
orders.
Uh-huh. So it begs this sort of interesting question that um and there's an interesting question now from Jonathan Russell, which actually I'm going to kind of get at, Jonathan. So Jonathan Russell, thanks for the question. Ask, why is the theory curriculum still centered on 18th century European music? Is it just inertia? Well, let me begin that, tackle that, and maybe add a few things, and then you guys weigh in. I think part of this is, and this sort of comes back to like, why we so heavily front load the 18th and 19th century in music theory, and a fairly contained musical style, if you will. And then it's sort of like, well, once you've done that, then you can kind of do all the other stuff, and it seems almost like an add-on. The 20th century always seems like this kind of add-on, like, oh, well, now there's this bonus unit of like essentially 120 years since
Right.
1899, 1893, whenever Debussy started, really breaking things down. So, and so there is this, and I actually, Pete, I kind of applaud at least the initial approach or attempt by your curriculum to try to begin the process of rethinking, I suppose, the order, because we tend to teach this like history, like Eric, you said, we teach it like it's a history class, and it's a history class, and it becomes not, music theory doesn't really tell you what you should do. It tells you more like 9 out of 10 times this occurred in this time period, right? It's a statistical analysis class, right? Of like, these are the tendencies, these are the things that occurred. And I think it's caught up in a couple of things. It's caught up, of course, in a long-standing historical precedence where it was taught like this for the last 150 years. And it was kind of like, well, I learned it that way, so you have to learn it that way, kind of thing, by some teachers, right? Where it's sort of, this is just the way it is, and we don't really question it. I don't think that that's necessarily true today, but I think that kind of kept that system, it kept promulgating this notion, this idea of, this is how we're going to teach it. The other thing is that we tend to think of these basics of tonal music as being foundational. In other words, if you learn triadic harmony and you learn counterpoint and you learn these things, you're learning sort of this foundation by which then everything else builds upon, right? This is sort of like a scaffolding, right? So we tend to think, and whether this is true or not, but I think we tend to think that, well, we can't teach 20th century music without the students understanding like how two chords go together in tonal music. It's like the fear of like, well, if they don't know what a triad is, how can we teach them what a trichord is, right? And I also think that there's that there tends to be I have to say, this is one of the things I've noticed. A lot of the students that come through my class, come into my classroom, are less and less prepared in the traditional sense. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to get the fundamentals. Like, this is a perfect fifth. This is the circle of fifths. This, this is, I find myself even in upper level music theory classes, like having a day where my head explodes because I put a triad up on the board and they can't identify that it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished. And I'm like, how that, what? Like they forgot.
Just one day, just one day.
Well,
is when your head
okay,
explodes.
allow me to give me the moment. Yeah,
Just kidding.
yeah. But I have those
Yeah.
moments a lot because part of it is that our students, and I don't know about your students, but my students don't work. They're not touching music palpably in a way that reinforces these things, right? They're this also comes to that two things. Um, it comes to background preparation. So like when we think about students coming to our classrooms being prepared, we think of like, oh, you've been playing piano since the age of 6 or whatever, right? Um, but also modalities. A lot of the students that come into my classroom are producers, and I put the quotes around producer. Um, their interface is a laptop and a DAW. They don't see chords. They see this is a blue block and this is a red block. And this is, I broke the blue block and the red block and it goes bing, 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 bing. And they don't think in terms of necessarily, they're not thinking in the same way in terms of harmony and melody. They're thinking in terms of beat making, which is a whole
But
other aspect,
some
right?
of them make incredible music.
Oh, absolutely. No, this is not,
Yeah.
this is not a disparaging comment. I'm just saying
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they come in with having different skill set.
Yeah.
And so then you start teaching them, well, here's the circle of fifths, and it's like you're teaching a completely foreign language.
Yeah.
Like there's no, I played trumpet when I was I played in jazz band in high school, so I kind of have an understanding of what this is. It's like I have no understanding what this is. So there tends to be this like I don't have enough hours in the day to teach the fundamentals just to get to the point where I could teach anything beyond that, right? It consumes a lot of my teaching, right? At my university, it does. And so I also think that we tend to spend like let's talk about the augmented sixth chord for a second. I think that's not it's not hard. I can teach the augmented sixth chord in 5 minutes. We're done. Finished. We don't really need to spend a whole chapter on it. And so, and then it sets up like a precedence of sort of how tonal music started to fall apart too, right? So it's kind of an interesting historical thing. So you teach it, and then, but also it kind of is used. It's just used in a different way in 20th century pop music. We just don't call it the augmented sixth chord. I mean, in fact, an altered dominant, the French augmented sixth chord is just a dominant 7/5. It's just, that's all it is. So jazz players use that all the time. So when I taught at University of Tennessee, where they have a jazz department and a good one, I had half in music theory, like theory 2, I had half the students were the classical students, half the students were like in the jazz program. And I literally had two different ways of explaining it. So the classical students, I kind of had to go, well, it's this and this. And then I looked at the jazz kids and said, it's a dominant flat 5. You had the flat 9 rootless voicing for German. They were all like, oh, that's cool, totally. And then they were done. They understood it. The classical kids are like, right? I think it's just a matter of application too, right? So
Well, I think, yeah, and Elliot, I mean, there's so much to unpack with what you're just saying.
anyway,
And
sorry for saying this. And we've had
no, that's
you know,
amazing. I mean, and just I'm trying to build. I want to build on it. I mean, and to Jonathan's question too is, but one of the things you were just getting at right there is the type of institutions that exist out there and the type of departments that are out there.
mhm,
And Stetson is a school of music, and we're all undergraduate, and but we have about 250 majors or so. So it's a fairly nice size undergraduate program, but it's more or less a conservatory style
mhm,
school of music,
mhm,
classically trained for the most part. And so we are of that tradition of that you were just describing, I think. Whereas, maybe to get to Jonathan's question, not all programs do it that way. Not all programs do the 18th
right,
century European central, type of thing. I think there are and there are some attempts to move away from that, I think, as well.
mhm.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said that you were talking about, Elliot, about the tradition of teaching, learning, and then teaching again. And you can summarize it as, the box theory, which is that, we spend 9 years from our undergraduate all the way to our doctoral graduation, right?
Hmm.
Um, filling boxes, and we all have boxes, right? Of this
Hmm.
notebooks, books, and everything that's currently sitting in our garage right now, right? Collecting dust and what have you, of you know pretty much European centric theory and music study and music history, right? These are the things that we had to study and bone up on for our exams and our exit exams and so forth. And we had this built into us, and then we graduate and we go and find an academic job somewhere,
Hmm.
and right away, your first year, you are expected to hit the ground running, right? So you're not going to start your first year as a professor thinking, I wonder how relevant this theory
Right.
class is to the rest of the world. Let me think about a new way of approaching this. You're gonna take out your notes from your boxes, and you're gonna plop them down, and you're gonna write out a lesson plan and so forth and so on. And
Hmm.
then I would say that unless you really um, devise the time in some kind of sabbatical, like you're thinking about, Elliot,
Hmm.
that a typical professor in a typical life cycle, right? Especially if you're a composer, where you're expected to write music and do other
Hmm.
things besides thinking about theory, right?
Hmm.
Um, you're not going to sit down. Uh, you're going to put all this time and effort into um, coalescing everything that you learned during those 9 years into a wonderful 15-week lesson plan, and you're not going to get out of that, right? That's 9 years worth of work, right? And it's
Mm.
going to take a lot more time and effort. So I think there could be, I will just say this, there could be a problem with how we we sort of use our professors in terms of like their role, like
Right.
is it just to kind of, or can we give them time to readjust things? And I don't know if we get that time as much as maybe
Yeah.
we could.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Eric. I think that's a challenge, and sometimes we get kind of stuck on our ways, possibly, and
Hmm.
it's when you get there. So I agree. At the same time, and again, this is I give credit to my colleagues. There are a lot of young theorists who are really pushing the envelope,
Yeah.
I think, which is, and that's exciting stuff.
Hmm.
And I can only speak for my personal journey, but I was very much what Eric was just describing. It's sort of like, this is how I learned it, and maybe as I got to University of Minnesota, when I first started my master's in theory, that was more like, wow, there's so much I don't know, and so I'm just trying to learn all of these things I
Right.
realized I didn't know, and
Right.
then by the time you get to teaching this, either as a TA or as
Mm.
when I was doing my doctorate, even, or even now, yeah, you fall back on those things,
Right.
and I admit I take cues from. I consider myself sort of early in my career, but I'm not the older part of my career. I'm not exactly a spring chicken, but I get excited with like some of the first second year colleagues
Yeah.
that I see, and they're
Right.
like, no, like, we it's time to do more. We need to do more, and I find myself falling into, yes, we can, but give it some time,
Right.
let it breathe.
Right.
Yes, we can make,
Yeah.
yes, we can and should make changes, and we, I
Right.
think, can get there,
Right.
but
Right.
it might not be,
Like the same. Right.
clearing just sweeping the table clean or something.
Sure.
I don't know.
Sure.
That's and
Sure.
that's and that's me. I can only speak for
Yeah, and
myself.
I certainly was definitely coming from a composer's perspective, and even somebody who's not a composer who is also teaching theory, but doesn't, for instance, won't get expected or won't be expected to write a theory treatise during their sabbatical. There are so what do they do? How do they deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly,
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say this from the composer's perspective. If there is a theorist that can come along that can bridge those concerns that we just talked about. For example, how do you teach theory to undergraduate students in a way that you can change the sequence, right? You don't necessarily have to do one sequential thing like we're
Sure.
talking about,
Sure.
and you can teach the elements of music so that if next year you want to kind of plop in a completely different tradition,
Mm.
you can make that work without having to take 5 sabbaticals as a professor
Right.
to work all those things in.
Yeah.
I think there's a logistical problem that's hidden underneath all these
Sure. It's
really good questions.
time is a lot of it, and energy is a lot of it, right?
Mhm.
And uh, it takes a lot of time and energy to not only to think of new approaches, but also to think of new approaches in good ways, like good strategies, right? It's one thing to say, oh, let's do it this way, but then to actually actualize that in a classroom effectively is a whole other thing, right? That requires a lot of preparation. And for those of you at home who might be thinking that, we're professors and we get our summers off and we basically don't do anything but lounge around, I'm sorry, we spend a lot of time thinking about this very stuff, even if we're not necessarily changing the world. We're thinking about our students, we're thinking about our teaching, we're doing class prep, we're doing grading, all of this stuff. And so then to be able to tack on to, oh, by the way, let's just change the whole theory curriculum. Or it's like, when?
You forgot assessment, right?
Oh,
You
assessment,
Yeah,
right.
yes, we have to assess
Right.
what we're doing. That's
a
There's
lot of
a
professors laughed on that
there's
one.
a yeah, there's a really good meme that I
I'm
saw
in
of
trouble now.
Plato teaches us that the more you learn, the less you know, or something like this. And then, the administration says, well, I'm sorry, that's not a measurable learning outcome. So, but anyway, don't get me started about assessment.
Sorry.
There's a question. Well, this is sort of, again, related to what we're talking about from Bruce Lazarus. Hi, Bruce. Saying, what is the overarching goal of music theory? Which is kind of a huge topic, right? I think we all could answer that in a variety of ways. And maybe
Well, I can jump in,
let's
maybe.
let's take Bruce's question. I have some other thoughts related to what we were just talking about. But let's take Bruce's question up at face
I mean,
value.
yeah, yeah, that's a big question, Bruce. I think, and we're not going to solve that here
Yeah.
tonight, but
Yeah, let's do it in
um,
5 minutes.
yeah, but how did he
He
sort of
said,
pose it?
quote, what is the overarching goal of music theory?
Goal, okay, yeah, and maybe we should expand it to goals. I mean, because I think
Right.
there are a lot of things
Right.
that you could go,
Mhm.
but a couple of things popped into my head. One of which, and if we're stuck on the augmented sixth chord tonight,
That's a good
which is
example.
okay,
Good chord.
which is, yes, I do care about spelling, and I care that you can resolve the German augmented sixth chord to a cadential 6/4 and resolve it the right way. But at another level, I care that you go through the process of learning.
Mm-hmm.
I care that you critically think about something and learn how a system works and how things then turn into other things and how the
Mm-hmm.
reaction of things, like the process of learning in music theory, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And for us who teach at smaller universities, and I think kind of in a liberal arts type of atmosphere, to be able to, just, do I care if you can spell a augmented sixth chord 5 years from now? I mean, don't tell my students, but I mean, kind of not. But I mean, I do, but I kind
You
of
won't
don't.
be there to grade them, man.
Right. But when I was teaching them in music theory to go through that process,
Sure.
that for me, that's a better goal
Sure.
for me. It's kind of an outcome for them, whether they realize that or not.
Sure.
So that's just one way to get started. I think there are other
Sure.
things. I had a second thing, and I forgot what I was going to say. It'll
Sure.
come back to me, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I'm going to tag on to that, but I want to let Eric. You want to take up the?
No, I was going to say,
question on your end?
coming from the composer's perspective again, I think the overarching goal should be to become a good investigator. So,
Hmm.
if you, for instance, if let's take a practical stance, all right, if you hear something, and you really like what you hear,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to use that sound, or maybe it could be an event that happened or in this piece of music, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to know why it worked, not just necessarily being able to pluck it, anybody can copy things, right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but what theory does is it allows you or gives you the skills to take a look at a lot of different things at once. And so we're not just teaching them to look at the key signature and here's the chord or whatever, because
Mm-hmm.
there probably won't be a key signature in this particular case, but to look at the voicing, like you're talking about, Elliot, you stress that a lot. Look at register, look at the
Mm-hmm.
rhythm. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
what is the timing and spacing
Mm-hmm.
like on this event that happened
Mm-hmm.
that really made you go, wow, that was amazing,
Right.
And that's one thing I think that at least when I definitely get into the 20th century, I talk about a lot. And so I think it's just being able to you know let's put it this way: before they took theory, right, they could say, I really like this piece, that was a cool piece, had a good
Mm-hmm.
vibe to it.
Mm-hmm.
When they graduate, with a theory background,
Mm-hmm.
they could say, yeah, I have the tools to be able to break that apart, and I can probably do it somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
that's kind of what I was thinking. It's the I coming in, I like this piece, and then once you get through sort of
Mm-hmm.
understanding of music theory, how music works, you can say why,
Right.
right.
why I enjoyed it.
Why,
And so
or
anyway,
or at least unpack some reasons why.
yeah.
Right. Some reason why this works. Right. Or at least what the materials are. I think it's there's a lot of things here. Uh, when I think about music theory as a whole, I think about a number of aspects. And so one is the materials and techniques aspect. So as a composer, I'm looking for materials and techniques. Like I'm looking for, okay, these are materials, these are techniques, this is sort of how these things go together, right? So you're kind of looking at historicity, right? Kind of like what happened before that led up to where you are now, and what's in your ear now. And that could be lensed through not just sort of the classical canon, but it could be lensed through, any kind of musical style, right? You can look at it as materials and techniques, right? So once you understand the basics of some way to talk about material, in other words, like talk about pitch and rhythm and basically the building blocks, then you can then talk about the assembly of those building blocks, right? You can talk about um, you know what happened before and what usually happened, and then you can talk about what could happen, right? So those are different things. The other thing that I think about with music theory is, and Pete, you touched on this, and this again doesn't have to be necessarily focused in a specific genre or whatnot, but it's the discipline of doing something. It's the practice of doing something. It's the focus of doing something, right? It's kind of like, people say, well, why am I learning trigonometry when it's not gonna help me balance my checkbook? Okay. It's the same thing when you're talking about learning sonata form, when you might not ever write sonata form. Maybe it doesn't help you with your DAW, like with your producing. But at the same time, the effort spent in learning that process and learning, unpacking it and getting that kind of level of resolution and detail and being able to talk about music on a certain level, that's no more than just, hey man, that was really cool. it says something. It gives constructive. It builds a constructive framework, right? Hopefully, what we hope, right? One of constructive analysis, right? The constructive sort of tell me why you liked it. Don't just tell me you liked it, or tell me why you didn't like it, but give me reasons. Give me some reasons. Like back up your argument. And so this kind of discipline of working through the repertoire, it could be again, we could talk about apples and oranges or whatever, right? But you're still talking about a practice, right? An underlying practice, a set of guidelines that govern this practice. And I think there's really something valuable in that kind of discipline and in that kind of rigor, right? Of doing it, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also at least I'd like to think so, regardless of what kind of new sort of pedagogical approach or rearranging the blocks or how things might go in the future. And I'm going to be thinking about that quite a bit on my sabbatical. Regardless of what a student's connection to music is post graduation, having that solid, if you will, hopefully we all deliver a solid foundation, will help, even if that music that student is working with has nothing to do with anything that you taught them specifically. That they might not really do, like they're not necessarily going to write 12-tone music. They're not going to necessarily write, classical sonata form, but learning something about form might help them with their songwriting. Learning something about, say, 12-tone system might help them something about organization of pitches in ways that they hadn't thought of, or melodic material, or perhaps just even the technique of doing things like retrograde, inverting and things, right? Which is sort of like, you can do that in DAWs. You can select the whole thing, your melody, and let's just flip it around and make it sound different, make a new melody out of it. They're already kind of doing it without realizing what they're doing. So this is basically another way of saying, by the way, you already know how to do this. You've heard this a million times, but we're just going to give it a label now so that now you can identify what you're doing, so you can do it with intention. There's intentionality here that you didn't have before. Before, you were just kind of stumbling in the dark and just, hoping that you were going to get a good result. This is actually potentially going to give you some tools to give you a better result, or the result that you want, more quickly. So I would also like to say that I like to think of music theory as a means to an end, rather than just a means. The means to an end of a practical application. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and Erich, you mentioned about this. Like I want to, when I reframe music theory for myself and for my students, I want to frame it always with the question of why we're learning this. What is it going to potentially give the student hence? And so when the student asks, why don't we write parallel fifths in part writing? I get that question every semester. Yeah, I teach it. I don't say parallel fifths sound great. They sound great. I can throw you a million examples of parallel fifths. Even parallel fifths by people like Bach wrote parallel fifths sometimes, right? It's not that parallel fifths are bad, but we have to explain why we do this, why we teach that particular thing. It's something about voice leading and the discipline of working with limited resources. And then from there, you develop a kind of sense of craft that then even if you're writing parallel fifths all day long, you're aware of the parallel fifths. You're aware of, that blending of the overtone series and whether or not you've got independence of line, if you'd want independence of line or not, for example. And I could go on and on, but I digress. I'm just sort of throwing a bunch of things out in response to sort of Bruce's question. By the way, if you guys have other questions, please ask.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, what you're talking about, Elliot, is something that's very interesting, and to kind of tie everything together based on what, Pete and all of us were talking about is that So we've listed a few things that are important to us when it comes to teaching theory and what we want our students to be able to do after learning theory, right? Which is, for instance, learning context, learning relationships, learning discipline, learning a practice or an approach to understanding sound and what it does and why. Um, and so we could do that with any music, right? We don't have to necessarily do that with Mozart symphonies or
Hmm.
Right.
Beethoven
Yeah, I
piano
was going to say
sonatas.
that sort of thing too. I mean, the generalization of things like form can be drawn from
Sure.
anywhere. I mean, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. But
No, no,
I
yeah.
agree, absolutely agree with Eric. Yeah.
So I think I think one thing, if we were to like, you know, sort of ride the theme of rethinking, music theory pedagogy is, perhaps if there was a way to, and there is a way, certainly.
Yeah.
We've seen
Yeah.
it, and we know about it. But if there was and I'm going back to my logistical thing because I'm all about, I have 4 kids. I have a composition career. I have 2 projects I'm doing, and I have 2 orchestral commissions right now. So that's
You
just
can always give
I'm
me one of them, by the way. If you're overloaded, man. I mean,
see
I'll happily take one for you because I'm a
the
buddy.
the hair is definitely leaving and getting grayer. So
Anyway.
yeah.
See, this
So it's
is
like
funny. I don't know if there's an analogous. Will you please take over my theory? I feel like theorists don't have this argument that you composers do necessarily.
well, yeah, we change all the time, right? That's no, just like I think, and probably musician like or not like instrumentalists who teach. I have a guitarist friend who Andrew Reinhardt, who's a great guitarist, but also a fantastic theory teacher. And he teaches theory, but he is constant. He's doing a lot of recitals, and so again, the logistical thing does come back. Like if there was a way that we could shift and again take the things that are important to us
Hmm.
as teachers, like which we
Hmm.
just listed there, and kind of shift the music, find new ways. Again, it's not going to happen overnight, like we talked
Right.
about. This
Right.
will be over time, but I think that's going to help the relevance question a little
Right.
bit, and at least deal with the issue that I think Elliot you pointed out earlier, which is that a lot of your students are coming in with a completely different experience than
Right.
we did
Right.
when we were coming into school in the 90s and whatnot. I have students who, like you said, they deal with sequencing programs. They don't practice like I did. I was a violinist,
Right.
and I would play Mozart's
Hmm.
41st Symphony.
Hmm.
Play my little part, my second violin part,
Hmm.
with the stereo going. Okay, that's the kind of nerdy stuff that I did.
Right.
But I didn't work with beats. I didn't work with I didn't do what I guess what they call it chopping, right? So I didn't take
Hmm.
different ideas or recordings and implement. I wish I did actually, because that's a really cool practice
Hmm.
in terms of being able to create works from existing sounds. So you know, how do you get them interested and pull them into that discipline with the understanding that hey, at the end of the day, um, this music will be even closer to what you'll be doing later on. Because I do agree with you, Elliot, that the discipline thing is very important, but I do think I kind of want to lean on the thought that relevance sort of does matter in a way, because I think that's going to be the motivating factor for a lot of students.
Hmm.
If I'm going to be doing this after I graduate, I better know this, right? But if you're thinking as a student, and I understand, I get it because I was thinking this too. Why do I need to spell this, French 4.3 or German 6.5? I can, I'm not going to be writing this stuff later.
Right.
Um,
It's
I
not
don't
going to
know.
balance your checkbook. Yeah.
Well, and it's not going to get the commission. It's not going to get the what. So um, but I do agree. Certainly not refuting your the importance of practice, but I wonder if there's a way that we can, I don't know,
No,
try to,
I think the relevance
um,
is really important, and it's not, and we can't. I don't think we should be saying, well, you have to learn this stuff because this is the way you should do it. I mean, you need to be able to. One of the things I enjoy about being a college professor is to watch my students find themselves
Right.
and grow, right? And so part of
Hmm.
this is maybe in in some small way in my music theory class where it's like, well, I've listened to this pop music all of my life, you
Hmm.
know, and so, well, yes, I want to try to make this stuff relevant for what you care about, but
Hmm.
also push you just a little bit to say, you know what, there's other stuff out there. So
Right.
you might be able to use the
mm,
things we're learning here to either enhance what you want to do,
Right.
because you've been hearing this your whole life,
Hmm.
or open yourself up to new possibilities or new musics that you've
Hmm.
never thought of. So there's a
Hmm.
relevance, I
right.
think, here, right, with what Eric's saying. There's a relevance to what they already know. And let's face it, no offense to the students out there, so there are some students who show up that think, I know lots of stuff. But then most of them, by the time they graduate, they're like, yeah, I didn't know a lot of
Didn't really
stuff
know
when I
anything.
when I
Yeah. Right.
started.
Right. Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a very good point. The good point that theory is not just about techniques and learning how things work, but it's also a repertoire builder, for students
Yeah.
too, because I think
Sure. Sure.
that's where they hear the symphony for the first time
Right.
for some of them.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and
Good
again,
point.
hearing things in different ways, and it's not necessarily in the
Hmm.
context of like oral training, like, oh, can you hear something and write it down, dictation
Hmm.
or something,
Hmm.
but being able to hear form and whatever that means, from whatever Eastern, Western, Southern, Northern tradition you find, fine, but just being able to hear it, and
Hmm.
then that can help reinterpret maybe the whatever music they grew up with.
Sure. Sure.
Um,
Yeah. Sorry, Pete. Yeah.
no, that's fine.
The
I can ramble on forever, and
Yeah, I mean, these
I
are big
just
topics. We have a lot.
Yeah.
We have a lot
this
to.
is
There's a
yeah.
lot of things that we could talk about, and we're not going to solve all of the world's problems
Mm.
in our time here. This is just an opening discussion for what will be an ongoing discussion. But, um, the issue of relevance, Eric, to kind of get to to get to your point is one, of course, I've been thinking about too. And I actually do this
Mm.
because I teach the electronic music sequence. So
Mhm.
I literally am teaching EDM and um, dubstep and, um, you know, um, lo-fi and bit crushing and that. I mean, I'm teaching that in electronic music class. I'm not teaching it in music theory class. I'm not really teaching it because the kids kind of already know a lot of that stuff, but I'm teaching like, well, this is how you can get that lo-fi sound using this software. And I talk about those materials, but in a different, from using a different angle. But when I have the same students in my theory class, I'm always trying to connect to them with something that might be somewhat relevant. Like, you know,
Mhm.
like sonata form, well, like in Ableton, when you have these arrangement view and you've got these blocks, think of this block as being, this green color, in your piece, and
Right.
this is the red color block, right? And so to think about themes and this in a way that makes sense for them, even if they don't have the strength of like looking at the score and parsing the notation. And again, that's a challenge too. It's an uphill lift also for me, especially in my school, because I'm not necessarily dealing with students that come in really having almost any music notation skill whatsoever. So I'm literally teaching them what a G clef is and what a fifth is first, and then teaching them, oh, there's this chord, there's that does this, right? Um, so it does, although, give me an opportunity to teach harmony vis-a-vis the overtone series.
Mhm.
And that's how I teach harmony. So I'm starting to think about this, unpacking the historical lint trajectory and making it more vertical, in the sense, so rather than linear, more this way, in the sense that maybe teach, like, say, here's triads and here's examples of triads all throughout history. Here are examples of seventh chords. Here are examples of ways that these harmonic progressions go together, root motions. So we can look at this song by Cyndi Lauper. We can look at this thing. We can look at Mozart. We can look at this, whatever, is to try to kind of, and of course I'm a jazzer, so I'm always trying to bring in jazz, right? I'm always bringing in, like, every time I talk about sequences, I bring in giant steps, right? And especially talking about chromatic third relationships. It's a great teaching tune for that. And modes, I actually, that's another thing. I don't want to get on specifics, but I think, like, traditional music theory does not address modes the way, and I think that I think one of the keys, no pun intended, is to actually, instead of talking about keys, talk about modes, talk about modal relationships. And I'm starting to really unpack that very deeply in terms of even tonal music, that it's actually modal music with major and minor tonal systems. And so I'm actually working more in that regard, and that's, I think, something like, so, like, then if you look at, say, Once in a Lifetime, Talking Heads, right? You can talk about that from a modal point of view, because you can say, oh, this is in that mode, or this is in this mode, right? And also this is modal interchange at work, and that's what makes that harmonic progression work.
Yeah, and I will say, just really quickly, again, this is not my area of expertise, but a lot of the new, not new, there are a lot of pop music theories out there. There's some really, really great research that's out there right now, and some of that addresses what you're talking about, I think, Elliot, and sort of, well, is this pop tune in this key or this key? It's kind of both. It's kind
Sure,
of
there's a lot,
neither,
right,
and
right.
so there are these kind of dueling tonalities, or modalities, almost. So yeah, I think it sounds like you're in line with what a lot of people are excited about, I think, in some circles, which is really cool.
And I think that would be an example of, in an interesting way, even though modes are, we can go back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Uh, because of the, sort of resurgence, or just a lot of the interest in a lot of the modes, using them, at least in the 20th century and beyond. Like, one piece that comes to mind is John Adams' China Gates, which actually is it simply uses, I think, like 4 or 5 modes, right? And it's sort
Right,
of
and it goes through alternating clock positions on the circle of fifths of modes.
Right, and it has a symmetry to it. And so
Right.
there's a lot of, really, again, going back to the things that we care about as theorists, it has all of those elements in there. You could talk about pitch collection. You can talk about, all right, here are the modes, and hey, a mode is a pattern of pitches, and it has certain, this is why it has this quality. And so, yeah, I think that seems to me, that kills many birds with one stone, in the sense
Right.
that, you can
Right.
teach all those things that we talked about. You can also tell them, this is how these composers used modes, right, to sing their chants. And then let's fast forward up to the 20th century, and this is China Gates.
Right.
And so here's another example.
Sure. And I'm even thinking about a modal theory as a more I'm even going more foundational, and I guess in some ways I'm channeling my inner George Russell in this, because my contention, and you'll see this will come out. My contention is that the grandfather mode of all diatonic modes is Lydian. And it is, because it's based on the perfect fifths. You do your first 7 perfect fifths is Lydian. And guess the full inversion of that is Locrian. Your first 7 perfect fourths is Locrian. So actually, for me, F is at 12 o'clock of the circle of fifths. That's why our circle of fifths is actually still stuck in daylight savings time. And I'm actually really serious
No,
about that.
that's cool.
I'm really
Yeah.
serious about that because if you think about modal interchange, think about modal interchange for 1 second. If you invert Ionian major, you get Phrygian. The fourth mode of Phrygian is going to be your minor subdominant. That's why it works. It's a modal inversion, which is why all those chords out of the minor subdominant and parallel minor work. But that's another story. Some questions. Okay, so we have several questions. First of all, Andrew, most, if not all, by the way, Bruce thanks us for the responses. Andrew says, most, if not all, of the young electronic musicians I know, I think you meant do not read any music notation whatsoever, which is true. Question, given that a lot of music is ear-based, how do you stop listening to your ear? I find it hard to avoid going to the basic chord progressions, given that that's what I've grown up listening a lot to.
Yeah, I think we kind of addressed that a little bit.
I think we did. And I want to posit this one thing. And I think the misunderstanding, I think, by some people when they think about music theory is that music theory doesn't address the sound of music. And I don't know, you guys, I'd like to get your input on that, like the reconciled sort of like the nerd space of music theory, right? When we can sort of talk about, oh, this is the Neapolitan sixth chord and whatever, versus what it sounds like, because ultimately music is all about sound, right? And I think that's probably what the gist of that question I think is meant to ask is I think maybe the connection to the ear. And I'm probably not even talking about because usually like musicianship skills like ear training and sight singing is always relegated to the Department of Theory. And actually, I kind of have an issue with that. I think that should be separate in some ways, connected, related, but separate, because it feels like they're two separate things. It feels like, ear training by itself is just like, that's like the calisthenics, but it's not really the music theory part. But I think the semantics really. But anyway, you guys have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to try to get to the question, I think I guess that's makes sense, and I think that's common. And I'm trying to spin back to what I mentioned just a little bit ago, is just that learning new ways of hearing things. So like, oh, I keep going back to what I learned before theory, and well, use maybe theory to find new ways to hear the same thing in different ways. Can maybe help break that notion of trying to fall back into what you already. Well, I'm just going to use the same chords I kind of learned as from before or something. So I mean, I would say challenge yourself to listen to new music. I'm a big advocate for new contemporary pieces and new music. So don't shy away from things that don't use the same basic chord progressions that you're already used to. You don't have to like it. But I think opening yourself up to new music will help you recontextualize things.
Yeah, and I think those two issues there, like, so again, that's the part of the repertoire building, that we're talking about, which is a nice sort of effect of learning theory in a formal way, but also that music theory should not be divorced to what you're hearing. I think we should be we should be tying that together, because after all, what's the use of theory if you can't hear what's going on? Now, I mean, and that can that I think is the sort of the foundation for a lot of arguments in theory. If you look at the history of music theory, that's been it's like, what is the the discussion of the minor third and its relationship within a triad. Is that, what am I hearing exactly? Can we call this chord this chord? Is that what I'm hearing? I think is so important that it does spawn a lot of really good arguments in theory. And to your thing, Elliot, I think you're absolutely right that it's interesting how ear training focuses on certain things, but uh, at least the ear training that we're teaching on a usual basis, it's almost like its goal is to perfect singing or being able to sight read simple diatonic melodies. But I don't think students are really getting a lot of the effects of the sound teachings from music theory in ear training.
Right.
It's like they're so myopically focused
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
I got to get my syllables right and I have to get this
Yeah.
down.
Right.
That I'm
Right.
really not thinking about context. I don't know if
Yeah.
you guys feel that way. I thought I'd just throw that grenade
Sure.
out there.
Sure.
Just,
Yeah, I think a
Okay.
little bit, and yeah, and kind of the flip side of that, I think there maybe we as instructors, and this of course I think it varies from institution to institution, struggle with getting the students to listen to what they're doing, or
Right.
when I emphasize, okay, you're learning form, you can't analyze that, you have to listen to this piece,
Yeah.
you
Right.
have to spend the time to
Well.
do it. Yeah, we're doing part writing is not music, part
It's
writing is an exercise, but play it, connect to it,
play it.
listen to what you've created. and
Yeah.
and I think it's a struggle for a lot of
Oh
music
God.
theory teachers to get students to do that.
Can I get on a soapbox for like 1 second? And if
That's
there are any of my students watching, you've heard me say this before. I use Note Flight when I have get my exercises. They can push the button that says play. Right? Blink. How often do they do that? They don't do that. They don't even push the button. When I was in school, and this is going to sound like I walked uphill in the snow both ways, I had to find a piano that wasn't occupied in the conservatory, which was hard to do, before my theory class, and play through with my horrible piano chops. I'm not a pianist. Fumble my way through to make sure that my stuff didn't sound like crap before I put it up on the board to be sung by the class, right? And I actually enjoyed it because I wanted to hear what this stuff sounded like, and I tried to challenge myself to hear what I was writing, to kind of build that reflexive process of like hearing the score, right? Hearing that which is a skill to develop. But like they have no excuse and they don't play it, and like there's like minor ninths because they forgot to put accidentals in there, and the thing sounds horrible. And I'm like, did you even play this? And then I'm like, here's my saying is, if it sounds like shit, it probably is. That's and most of the time I'm right. So,
well, I'm sure you've gotten the question, do I get extra credit for at least getting the note name right? And it's
I
like,
mean, no, boy,
B
that
flat
geez,
sounds a little different than B natural,
it
but
does.
well,
And in that
Yeah.
context, yeah, that's we're not to that. We're not to those chords yet. But especially in diatonic writing. But anyway, I this is like another issue, right? It doesn't have to. I mean that's a separate kind of issue. It's just motivating students to actually do the work. It could be a relevance issue too, right? And it's also like, why am I doing this? Why is McKinley making me do this stuff, right? And I'm always trying to tell them this is why we're doing it, right? And I feel like that's part of my job is to A, figure out a better way to do it, if there is one, and B, to always tell them that this is the reason why. And students that have stayed with me, like for example, like Justin. Yeah, Justin Moore. So the two of you know Justin. I don't know if you remember Justin. I know. Okay.
Yeah.
Justin is one of my IUE students, and Nate, of course, and those guys. But even the students that I have now, after they've been with me for 4 years, I can look at them and say, I know that you had these moments, like I can tell other students who are like in my class, and they'll come in to visit me, and I'll say, you have no, like, you're looking at me like, why is he making me do this? Why is he doing this? And I'll say, I have a plan. And in about 3 semesters, it'll all click, and it'll be like, that's why you had me do that. Right. And the students that have had me go, absolutely, that's 100% true. It's like, I didn't know, I didn't know the process. Like, I didn't understand the process, but once I got to the end, I realized that this was the reason why we did it this way. It's the Mr. Miyagi thing. Why am I painting the fence? Wax on, wax off. Um, that's me, Justin. Yes. Hi, Justin. Nice that you tuned in. So we've saddled up to the 9 o'clock hour, and
I'm sure we have an answer. I mean, there's so much we haven't been able
there
to talk about,
there
and
is.
there might be questions we haven't answered, but
Netflix series. So
Yeah, right.
next,
Well, actually, my intention. So for those at home, my intention, of course, this was meant to obviously not solve all of the music theory problems in one go. And I think we may have a follow-up session where we might take some things that we've started talking about that maybe we can unpack further, and maybe allow the dialogue to continue. If any of you have questions, that if you're watching this on replay or just didn't get to ask your question, please put the questions in the comments section. Leave your questions, and we'll try to answer them either offline, or perhaps in the next iteration of this. Maybe we'll try to do another one before the new year comes. Hey, guys, this was great having you on. I really appreciate
a lot of fun.
having at least get this sort of ball rolling, and have a discussion amongst colleagues on things that we all think about on a daily basis, and that we will continue to be thinking about going forward. So again, many thanks to
You're
both
welcome.
to
Yeah,
both of you.
absolutely.
Great. So with that, I am going to switch over to me alone. There we go. And there's my name again. So thanks for joining us tonight. Again, if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, please leave them in the comment section. We will be happy to answer, and hopefully we'll do another one of these soon. I am going to promote the next episode of Composers at Home, Maybe Drinking Coffee. That's a week from Thanksgiving, so I will have my friend and colleague Daniel Bernard Remain come on the show. I hope you'll tune in for that. That'll be over on the Composers at Home, Maybe Drinking Coffee YouTube channel, and also over on the Facebook page by the same. I guess my name appeared again. Anyway, everybody, please have a safe and happy Turkey Day, wherever that may be. Practice responsible social distancing, and until next time, thank you very, very much.